Hey, look, welcome very much, Gary. Thank you so much for giving up your time for this session. And I appreciate it. We started off a while back before the budget, and we sort of led on to arranging this meeting in the light of the budget and an opportunity to talk about an Auckland lens, as you say, on the Auckland economy. So I'm very pleased that you've joined us, and I welcome you and invite you to present. The normal process is you talk for a bit, and then we ask some questions and have a bit of a chat and run the session that way. Thank you very much.
Well, kia ora, Phil, and kia ora koutou Fabians. Thank you for turning up and for your patience. I'm very pleased to be here. I've got some slides to help guide the conversation, and I suppose we can have some questions. Phil, you might hurry me up if I'm taking too long. Please.
No worries.
Yep. And am I coming through clearly in terms of sound?
Yes,
or
perfect.
I hop on the microphone?
Perfect.
Okay, well, that's great. Well, I'll just share my screen. There we go. And so Phil invited me to come and talk with you. My name's Gary Blick. I'm recently joined Auckland Council as Chief Economist. And I think Phil gave me quite an open brief to really just talk about Auckland, perhaps in the wake of Budget 2022, the government budget that was released recently. But I've also taken some liberties with sort of stretching the scope a little bit to really, touch on some broader issues. So tonight I thought a little bit about me and this role, and a bit of an overview of Auckland, and also trying to think about what is the role of a city from an economic perspective, and therefore how should we assess Auckland's progress and performance? And finally, what's on the horizon for Auckland? So as I mentioned, I'm in the role of Chief Economist. I think Auckland's a little bit unusual in terms of councils around the country. I think it really shows perhaps the advantages of scale. There's a role that's been established since the amalgamation of the former Auckland region councils. There's a Chief Economist who leads a small unit. I'm the fourth Chief Economist to have had the role since over the last decade or so. And really the role is to work with colleagues to improve the quality of advice to our elected members. And often that's bringing the tools or the perspective of an economist, which is really about trying to take a broad look at the impacts of policy proposals and try to weigh up what those proposals might mean for society's resources over time. And so there's that sort of internal advisory role in terms of supporting the work that's underway. And there's also scope to do a little bit of research and analysis into issues that may not get attention at an Auckland level from an economic perspective. And then finally, there's a role around building, I guess, public understanding of some of the policy choices that Auckland faces and some of the trade-offs, and that's where tonight fits in, that sort of wider brief to sort of work with the community and to share information and get debate going. I should emphasise it's a little bit of an unusual role in that Chief Economist does have some freedom to share personal views. They're not necessarily those of Auckland Council, and so I just wanted to emphasise that. But I think it really speaks to the maturity of the organisation that it's willing to allow this role. And also wanted to mention that most of the things that I'll be sharing tonight are in the public realm already. They're not always easy to find, but maybe my spin on them might be a little different. I thought it's worth just touching on, some of you may be familiar with economics in terms of how economists see it, but sometimes I think it gets a little bit of a bad rap. Sometimes people have a perception that it's all about financial markets, or it's all about some abstract called the economy, which is all about money flows that result in GDP. But really, in a public policy setting, economics is really just concerned with all resources, not only money, but the other resources that society has. So the time that people have, that's a resource. The environment around us is a resource. And also, I guess, our social and cultural norms, they're a resource as well as our sort of physical environment. So we're concerned with all of those capitals, if you will, and we're concerned about the choices that we have in terms of how we choose to use them. So economists are interested in not only at the individual level, but at the level of society. How society chooses to use its resources, which are in the end limited, And so what are the trade-offs if we use them for one option versus another? And we try to take a societal perspective, trying to look beyond just one group or a particularly affected group, but trying to take a broader view and to look beyond those whose voices you may not hear, to try and get an aggregate view of society, while not letting go, or also recognising that there are distributional effects that need to be analysed too. And I'd also emphasise that economics, particularly with the discipline of cost-benefit analysis, trying to weigh up those costs and benefits of proposals, we like to look long-term, multiple decades, because often, I guess, policy proposals, they can impact resources differently over time. Sometimes the costs are up front and they're felt quite strongly by some groups, but the benefits can be more widely dispersed and may accrue over time. And so that's why a longer term perspective is often called for. And then ultimately, when we're weighing up these choices with how we use our resources, we're trying to maximise welfare, trying to ensure that if we've got two competing options, that there's a way that we can, I guess, at least describe qualitatively, but hopefully quantitatively, start to put some sense of scale around the net benefit from an option relative to a different option, so that we can give decision makers the opportunity to maximise welfare. So that's my sort of whistle-stop tour of economics in a public policy sense. I think I'd like to just talk a little bit about Auckland. Maybe many of you have been long-time residents, but it perhaps may be of some interest anyway to have a little look at the snapshot of Auckland. So in terms of an urban area, in terms of a city, it's clearly the largest in Auckland, in New Zealand, but it only occupies a very small slice of the land area of New Zealand. But it does have over a third of the population. So we also, I guess, bat above our weight in terms of the productivity of the population, in terms of the measured output of the measured economic output, gross domestic product, referred to as GDP. So out of New Zealand's total, Auckland contributes about 38% relative to its population share, which is about 34%. That speaks to Auckland as a relatively productive region. It also contributes its share, or perhaps a little more than its share in terms of our estimates of tax revenue to central government. It's also a preferred location for most New Zealand, large New Zealand companies, and many of those global firms too choose to locate in Auckland. It's where most of the arrivals and departures, certainly pre-COVID, that's where they happen, and where most of the migration into New Zealand comes. It's really the home for most of New Zealand's high-end professional services, and we've got the second busiest seaport here, with Tauranga's activity just pipping us out at the moment. You're probably very familiar that a big chunk of Auckland is made up of people from elsewhere, so relative newcomers have chosen to make their home in Auckland, and as a result, it's often referred to as a very super diverse city. Obviously the largest Polynesian city, and many of the people who've come from elsewhere have come from some very large populations that we're familiar with. And then we've got some of the stats there that I won't labour too much, other than to say Auckland does have high incomes in a New Zealand sense, in terms of household incomes. I think Wellington might have a slightly higher household income. Perhaps that's distorted by the relatively well-paid jobs in the public service in Wellington. I thought it'd be interesting just to touch on the population growth. If you can see that, hopefully my little screen is in the way. If we look back over the last 25 years, we've seen fairly rapid growth of Auckland relative to the rest of New Zealand. So back in 1996, Auckland was 1.1 million people, about 30% of New Zealand's population of 3.7. And 25 years later, Auckland is 1.7 million out of 5.1 million. So it's 34% of the population now, and of the growth over the last 25 years, around 43% of it's happened in Auckland. So it's a growing city, and it's growing more quickly than New Zealand as a whole. And this chart really just shows Auckland relative to the rest of New Zealand. I sort of index them both. If we look at 1996 as a base year of 100%, it really shows that Auckland's sort of added 55% to its population, and the rest of New Zealand sort of grown by about 35%. And then those average annual population growth rates over that period, you can see Auckland outstripping the rest of New Zealand. Just some more statistics, really talking about the number of new jobs that have been added and the number of new people over the last 10 years. And to put some sense of scale around it, in the last 10 years, we've had 278,000 more people choose to make Auckland their home. And so that's equivalent to adding a Hamilton plus a Palmerston North, or if you want to cut it another way, a Wellington and an Upper Hutt, or perhaps two Dunedins, depending on what you relate to. And then a lot of those jobs have been, we mentioned 188,000 new employees over the last 10 years. 30,000 have been in construction, another 26,000 in professional services and tourism. Might surprise some, but it's been boosted as well. It's interesting that over the last 10 years, most of the new finance jobs have been in Auckland, and most of the new professional services jobs. And that really speaks to the role of Auckland city centre as a real sort of engine of those productive, well-paid jobs in finance and other professional services. And then when we look at the industries that make up the employee counts in Auckland, it is dominated by those professional services and technical services. These are the sort of official Stats NZ categories. So we've got food and beverage, retail, education with the two universities, and then administration and construction. So I think GDP, 120 billion, it's obviously not about primary industries. There's not much in the way of dairying going on here. There is a little bit, it doesn't register in the GDP figures. But instead it's, as I mentioned earlier, professional services, and you've got wholesale trade, finance, healthcare, some of those ones like telecoms. I've probably overdone it with stats, and I know I've got to be quick on time, so I might just jump ahead a little bit, Phil, if that's all right. Okay. And I thought it'd be interesting to sort of dig beyond those descriptive statistics and start asking, well, what's the advantage of cities? Why are more people living in cities, and why more people are choosing to live in Auckland? So we look at the idea of a city from an urban economics perspective, from the field of urban economics. There's really a lot of research gone into, I guess, the value of cities in terms of the proximity that they enable, and then the population density that they enable. And so you can really see cities as a place where people and businesses can choose to co-locate, to exchange labour, to exchange capital and ideas, and to really produce and consume and enjoy leisure options. And so we've got a concentration of people and businesses in proximity, particularly in the city centre. And that really brings advantages in terms of it's easy for people and businesses to connect with each other. The costs of getting around are a bit lower because the distance between other people and other businesses, whether that's people to people or business to business, they're just a bit lower. So it enables ideas and knowledge to flow more easily than in areas where people are more dispersed. And then when you've got high population density at scale, then those proximity benefits really get a bit of a surge. So you've got those sort of a larger labour market with more scope for specialisation among workers, and for suppliers of services to other businesses, they can really specialise too. So that's why you find a lot of firms in New Zealand, in Auckland I should say, that you don't find elsewhere in New Zealand because there's a specialisation here. So taking together these concepts of proximity and population density enable more productive economic activity. And you often see these mentioned as agglomeration benefits, the benefits of a large number of people and businesses in a relatively confined area. And that's the real advantage of a city. And then from an urban economics perspective, I guess the way I see it anyway is that there are sort of two foundations for a city to perform well, and everything else really does rely on these foundations in terms of the economic performance of the city. And so firstly, I think it's useful to acknowledge that not all locations in a city are equal. So some locations in a city are quite special or quite valued because they're close to certain things. usually things that people want, whether that's the land that might be close to jobs or centres of employment, land that is close to transport links, or land that's got good amenities, whether that's close to schools, shops or beaches. And so that's why we see quite a lot of variation in terms of the land values across the city. What's going on is that those things that people value, whether it's employment or transport links or other amenities, that value is being capitalised into the price that people are willing to pay. And so we see differential land values across the city. And so the land that is most valued, if you can enable more people to live in those locations, then not only giving them more choice, but it's reducing their need to move around in terms of the things that they want to be close to, whether that's jobs or transport nodes or other amenities. And so by making more efficient use of land, we're really talking about land that is most valued, ensuring that it's the most flexibly used in terms of enabling more people to locate there. I mean, not all land is valued, but some of it is highly valued, and it's a limited resource because of those attributes. The second foundation is really in the space of transport. So a city that enables people and goods to move around freely. So having accessibility to transport networks and then being able to be mobile around those networks, that's really important for a city, for its economic performance. So we're really looking for accessibility to transport networks, whether that's road networks or public transport networks or active mode networks, and giving people choice so that they've got options to get around. So if we can get those things right, then we've got a better chance of attracting talent to a city, holding on to the talent that we've got, and a better chance of attracting businesses and capital. And then we've got a better chance of combining those things well to be a productive city. I think it's worth acknowledging that Auckland has taken some steps forward in terms of these foundations. My view is that with the amalgamation of the city and then the Auckland Unitary Plan, just summarised there as AUP, that was quite an important step forward, because for the first time all of the disparate plans across Auckland were put onto the same basis. And I use that term upzoning, but it's really just a phrase that gets used to refer to the fact that in terms of residential land, it enabled more to be done with land in some locations. That is, land that had been restricted to just single house use was upzoned to become more flexible in its use. So multi-unit dwellings, whether they're townhouses or in some cases apartments, were enabled. And so we've seen some uptake of that since the plan was enabled in 2016, late 2016. Now, there's been research done at the University of Auckland, some very clever people there who have been doing econometric modelling, and the conclusion is fairly robust, that upzoning that was followed by a material increase in the supply of dwellings. So the construction of dwellings over the 4 years following the implementation of the plan was much higher than would have occurred in the absence of the plan. And that really speaks to a step forward in terms of Auckland having a more responsive housing supply, because you would have seen headlines that have talked about rising house prices and the difficulties that people are facing when they're trying to get into the housing market. And there's a line of argument that perhaps Auckland had been a little more restrictive than it could have been in terms of its housing supply. So we can see the Auckland Unitary Plan as being an important step forward. And it's also worth noting that in that period following the implementation of the plan, house prices stabilised for a good 3 or 4 years. Of course, that hasn't been the case since the onset of the pandemic, and I'll talk about that in a moment. I think it's also important to highlight that on that foundation of transport accessibility, Auckland has taken steps forward with the conception of a rapid transit network. So we've seen the Northern Busway, the expectations of ridership have been far surpassed, and now you're seeing investments into the busway out towards the Eastern Busway, as well as the improvements to the rail network, and that's being extended with the City Rail Link. So really giving people a choice, more households anyway than before, in terms of having a system that can cut through congestion at peak times and isn't really held back by private vehicles clogging up roads because it's separated, and that's why it's rapid. And there's also been some investment into active modes, whether that's cycleways or walkways. And I think it's also been a bit of a step forward to all the work that's gone into the idea of congestion charging, which is really a way to look at how the infrastructure we've got, how we can perhaps spread some of the peak load onto those shoulders if a charge can encourage some people to distribute their trips differently. But, you know, if we're taking an even-handed look at Auckland, I think there are some questions that are worth asking in terms of the overall livability. So notwithstanding those steps forward that I mentioned, I think it's pretty clear that households have found the cost of housing to be a real challenge because house prices have pretty much outstripped incomes over time. I think it's worth highlighting that Auckland has been reliant on inward migration internationally for its population growth. In recent years, we've seen the net inflow and outflow from the rest of New Zealand. There's people moving into Auckland, but the number of people moving out have been a little higher than those moving in. And then we see that most of the personal trips still, residents still relying on private vehicles, and we've seen congestion worsening, not just in the vicinity of the city centre, but further out, and also not just around peak times, but into those shoulders during the day and into the weekends at times too. Now, I know some of that was disrupted by the pandemic, but we would expect to be able to look through that and assume those long-run trends are continuing. So I think I've mentioned some of these things verbally, but it's worth just sharing some pictures to make it a bit more engaging. So this one here is really a version of something you often see in the media. It's my version of it, but there are others that have similar numbers, but they all tell the same story. There's an upward trend over the past 20, 25 years in terms of the ratio of the median house price in Auckland to the median income. And it's really a multiple that it's just a really simple way to, I guess, look at how prices have gone ahead of income growth. Incomes have grown, but prices have grown more quickly. And it's really an indication of the challenge that people who are not in the housing market, they've got to amass a 20% deposit in order to purchase a home. Then it's really an indication of how much harder that's becoming over time. Now, this is a very simple measure. Sometimes there are more sophisticated measures that take into account the serviceability of the mortgage, and I'll touch on that in a moment, but I still think it's a simple measure that's worth having a look at as a starting point. Now, this is a chart that I wanted to share because it was published in March by the Infrastructure Commission, the Wahanga, and they've gone to the trouble to really look at, I guess, the estimated zoning capacity enabled under different plans for central Auckland, going back from the 1960s onwards. Really, I found it quite interesting that they have been able to come up with a ratio of how much capacity, or essentially how large the development opportunities are under the existing plan at the time for residential development relative to the size of the population in the city at that time. And it's really showing that in the 1960s, there was, relative to the population that existed, quite a large number of development opportunities in terms of the ability of the city to grow. But over time, we see some tightening. And with the Auckland Unitary Plan, it speaks to that point that it did unlock a lot more development opportunities across the city by enabling more dense use of land in some locations. But notwithstanding that, I think a lot of those opportunities tend to be in the outer parts of the city. Some of them are on the isthmus, but the outer parts of the isthmus. And so what this stylized diagram is really showing is that in most cities, the land values tend to be high in the centre, and further out, the land values tend to be lower. And then alongside that, you tend to get building heights, or the intensity of building developments tend to be higher in the centre where those higher land values are. So that's the triangle. But in Auckland, what we have is a situation where we do have very high land values in the city centre, and then we have a bit of a dip in terms of the level of density that's enabled. So I guess the area around the city centre, you find that the density and the building heights tend to be lower as a result of current planning regimes. And then what you find as you go out a little bit further, we see an increase. So a lot of the activity that we've seen in terms of new consents that's been enabled by the Auckland Advisory Plan has tended to be not closer to the city centre, but further out. And this is the point that I was mentioning earlier in terms of components of Auckland's population change. So if we look over the last 3 years, 2019 to 2021, we see that we start off with natural increase, so the number of births in the city, less the number of deaths. And we see that births outweigh deaths by some 13 or 14,000 a year. And then we see the number of people who, if we take into account net internal migration, so there are people moving into the city from the rest of New Zealand, but the people leaving tend to outnumber those people. And that number has been about 11,000 and then growing to 13,000. So it's tended to pretty much outweigh the natural increase. So while we've grown in terms of births being higher than deaths, that's been offset by more people choosing to make their home in other parts of New Zealand relative to the number of people from other parts of New Zealand who would see Auckland as a place where they would want to live. And so when we look at total population change, the final column, you'll see that it's almost entirely comprised of the net balance of international migration. Yes, people are moving overseas, but many more people are moving in or coming back. So that's really been the driver of Auckland's growth. And of course, in the most recent year, with the pandemic and the public health restrictions and the closed borders, we've seen a very slight drop in Auckland's population, which I would expect would be short-lived. So the point that I would make there is that if Auckland does have higher incomes, which it does, than the rest of New Zealand, it would make sense if there are higher incomes and opportunities to specialise in different roles, that you would see more people wanting to make Auckland their home, rather than more people moving out of Auckland. And so I guess I pose the open question around whether some of those points I was making earlier around the affordability of housing and the challenge of getting around the city, whether they've affected the livability of Auckland to the extent that it's not attracting people from the rest of New Zealand. In fact, it's got more people moving out. This is just some measures from Auckland Council's annual scorecard. Picked out the ones on transport and access, and I think it really is a way to start getting into the complexity of how well our city performs in terms of its transport system. So the first measure there is that it's just under 10% of jobs in Auckland are accessible to Aucklanders. That's at peak time in the morning, within a cut-off of 45 minutes using public transport. So it's really about to what extent can people get to work without using a car in the morning and not having to take more than 45 minutes. And you see that there's been no change. Yeah. So that's been flat, so that was the year to 2021. And then we see public transport trips. Of course, this has also been disrupted by the pandemic. We haven't seen any growth there. But the point that I really wanted to make with this slide is that it's not easy to benchmark the performance of a city, but there have been a few studies that have tried, and then I noted there was one that compared Auckland with Brisbane, Perth and Vancouver, and found that with that measure of the proportion of jobs that are accessible via public transport, Auckland does score quite low. So that really points to room to improve. There have been investments in the network and they'll continue, but there's a long way to go yet. We've talked about livability, but I also think productivity is something that is also impacted if we think that the city isn't necessarily making the best use of its land and isn't necessarily that easy to get around. So what we have here on the left is the GDP per capita. So that's really a measure of output on a per capita basis. And you'll see that the blue line is Auckland and the orange line is the rest of New Zealand. So clearly a premium, but we take that those two GDP per capita amounts and turn it to a ratio in terms of the extent to which Auckland hovers above the rest of New Zealand. You see on the right there that there was a per capita premium of say 15% around the year 2000, and it dropped down to below 10%, which means in simple terms, Auckland was probably about 10% more productive in terms of its output on a population basis than the rest of the country. And that has climbed up again to around 20. But the point, I think, when we look at benchmarking with other cities, including those in Australia, we tend to find that that premium for a productive city relative to the regions that it sits within tends to be much higher, around 30 or 40%. So that's not a definitive conclusion, but it's an open question around whether Auckland's as productive as it could be. I think it's worth touching on housing. So this is probably a busy looking chart, but it really points to the fact that we look around the official cash rate, the time of the onset of the pandemic in June 2020, or I should say April 2020 there, what we saw was an all-time low when the Reserve Bank cut the cash rate to ward off the risk of a drop in demand from the onset of the pandemic. And so what we had is a period of very low interest rates there, and what that led to, notwithstanding the tightening that we've seen as inflation has gotten underway, is an impact on house prices. With the lower interest rates, I guess people who wanted to buy houses found that their cost of finance was much lower under those low interest rates. And so this is really a chart showing the median or the midpoint of Auckland house prices in terms of sales over the last 12 years or so. And you can really see a couple of points in here in terms of what I mentioned earlier. So the first, this sort of break here is the period which we refer to as price stabilization. So after a period of price growth, we had the Auckland Unitary Plan become operative. And as I mentioned earlier, it did unlock a lot of development opportunities, and research indicates that the construction of houses was at a higher level than would have been in the absence of that plan. So not only do we see more houses being built, but we see a period in which prices stayed fairly flat. And then with the onset of the pandemic and the drop in interest rates, we see people finding that finance costs for mortgages were much lower, and so really being willing to bid up the prices of housing. And so we've seen really surging price growth in the last 2 years. Now it really reached its peak probably at the end of 2021, and we've seen it come down a little bit then, and that's again in response to interest rates. I should say the latest one here is that blue one which just came out, the blue line there showing the 0.5%, 50 basis point increase this month, and more signaled as well. So what we're really seeing is that house prices are quite sensitive to changes in interest rates, especially with the all-time low that we had recently, and then the increase. So if we look at what that's done in terms of building consents, and that's a measure of, I guess, new builds entering the development pipeline. So we saw with the unitary plan, I can just bring my cursor to the right point. Here we see a surge in the volume of houses being consented. That includes not only standalone houses, but multi-unit dwellings as well. And we see a little bit of uncertainty as the pandemic came on. Numbers dropped away a little bit, but with that rise in prices during the pandemic period from roughly April 2020 onwards, that's really a signal to the development market to say there is demand for houses, people are willing to pay more for them, and it's really a signal that there's high demand for houses, and so you see more consents being applied for and issued to try and meet that demand. And so it's the all-time consenting volumes, all-time high for consenting volumes in Auckland. And that latest data point is just out today, and we see that we've had almost 21,000 on an annual basis, 21,000 dwellings consented over the last 12 months. This is today's data, which has come out for the month of April. It really shows that the last 2 years, 2021 and 22, look at the month of April, I've had 1,600 building consents for new residences, and that's clearly above anything we've seen in the past, and really brought on by a combination of development opportunities being enabled by the Auckland Unitary Plan in 2016, and then the stimulation of higher house prices. And of course, having unlocked those development opportunities, then you've seen here that the market can be more responsive in terms of the supply. I think it's quite interesting to look back over time in terms of the type of dwellings that have been consented. I mentioned earlier that some of the changes in the Auckland Unitary Plan allowed for more intense use of residential land, and so we're seeing a real shift towards townhouses. If you look from 2016, that purple line, that's townhouses, sometimes referred to as terraced houses or units. They really do track upwards, and particularly from this period of 2020 onwards, really surging. So I guess that's partly in response to demand. Perhaps the price points for some of those townhouses are more affordable for some. Also, perhaps some of those townhouses are in locations that people value. But also it's because the unitary plan has enabled more intense use of residential land. We've seen some increase in apartments, but it's all, that's the red line, but it's all been townhouses in purple. And then the blue is the single house building consents. They're sort of at a level that we saw in the early 2000s. I should say this is a rolling 12-month total. If we want to just simplify it into standalone houses versus multi-unit dwellings or apartments and townhouses, then that's what the numbers look like. And if we want to look at multi-unit dwellings as a percentage of all building consents for dwellings, then we see that we're hitting 70% in recent times, or just this month, of 70% of new building consents for dwellings, multi-unit, either townhouse or. And that's a real shift from what we saw back through the early 2000s. It was sort of between 30 and 50 and fell away after the global financial crisis down to about 20%. This is a chart which I put in, which was really taking those median multiples, that idea of affordability. It's a model that we run in the Chief Economist unit at the council, and it's really just trying to say, if you have a median income and you've got a median house and you've had to take on a mortgage for that with a 20% deposit, given prevailing interest rates, what's going on with your affordability over time. So it's really an index, and it's really showing. If you look at the red line there, that's Auckland. And so it's really trying to, I mean, we could have picked an index point anywhere. We picked it at December 2006. And we're really looking at the combination of house prices increasing as well as changes in interest rates. And so what we saw here is with house prices increasing, interest rates were offsetting in terms of the monthly payments that would need to be made. And now what we're going to see with interest rates rising, then those monthly servicing costs will increase. So we'll start to see this red line trend right down. It needs to be updated, of course, but it's really just trying to introduce the idea that, I guess, affordability isn't just the purchase price and the hurdle of getting over that threshold of a deposit. It's also, you've got to look at it from the angle of what are interest rates doing and what does it cost to service that mortgage? Because if you've got an 80% mortgage to pay down, then how interest rates track, that is a lot. I was going to touch on the city centre and pandemic impacts, Bill, if I have a little more time.
We've got about another 30 minutes, Gary, but I wouldn't want you to take that whole time up. I'd leave a little bit for questions.
I understand. I'll whiz through very quickly. I was just going to say that, you know, people sort of expected the worst with the pandemic, but overall things have held up fairly well. I think the government's wage subsidy has helped smooth out any sort of employment shocks. We've still got very low unemployment and incomes have held up. But it has, I think it's really accelerated the uptake of remote working technologies. So not everyone, but a lot of people are in roles where they can work remotely. And so that technology was already available, but it's really more widespread. So you're seeing more people choosing to work from home. And you know, that might have productivity benefits. It's a trip they don't need to make, and maybe they feel flexible, they've got flexible time during the day. And that's something that, you know, employers and workers will determine over time where that equilibrium needs to sit. But I guess it has resulted in some harm to the city centre. We're not seeing the workers there, and that's on top of tourists and students not being there. And so this is just an attempt to really use cell phone coverage. So it's probably not the easiest chart to interpret, but essentially 100% is the day-to-day movements in the city in terms of people coming in prior to the pandemic, and you see the Christmas drop there. And then with the move to level 4 lockdown is the red, you see it really did drop down to you know, sort of 35% of people in the city on a given time. And so this is right up until the Delta lockdown. We haven't updated the data, but we will. But it's really showing that, you know, prior to the Delta lockdown in August last year, the city still hadn't really recovered in terms of people, workers going back on a day-to-day basis. So about 75% of pre-pandemic. And so the city does feel a bit emptier. We do see shops having closed. And what I would probably say, there's a bit of information here, but really the point is that the city centre's lost a bit of population. It had population growth of, you know, sort of 3 to 5% over in the years prior to the pandemic onset, and then in the year to 2021, it has lost, you know, sort of 3% of its population, has lost about almost 5% of employment, and GDP is down as well. And I think it's important to distinguish between a lot of large firms, professional services firms in the city centre have been able to continue operating because they have been able to make use of remote working technology. But it's really the retail and hospitality businesses that rely on foot traffic that have really suffered more. And I know, Phil, you wanted to leave some time, so I'll just whiz through this very quickly. And I wanted to just look ahead and say, we talked about the unitary plan being a step forward. It's enabled a lot more development opportunities. For Auckland, we've seen take up of that, particularly with the stimulation from higher prices. We've seen a lot more in the way of townhouses being built. But the government's announced that it's requiring the largest cities in New Zealand to implement Its national policy statement for urban development, which requires councils to enable high density, so up to 6 floors for walkable catchments around the city centre and around rapid transit network stations and around town centres, and then to allow medium density everywhere else. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there are different perspectives on this, and the government has its own rationale for requiring cities to implement this. On one hand, I think if we think about urban settings, they'll continue to evolve. There will be some upfront localised costs with the changing built environment. Some views may be obscured, and there would be some partial shading for some. And then, of course, there'll be infrastructure costs in terms of more density might use spare capacity in terms of pipes and roads, but it may trigger more investment in those areas. But there's a bit of a mouthful there, but I just wanted to highlight that cost-benefit analyses that have been done, they may be first attempts or partial, but they do conclude that society as a whole is likely to be better off from these changes. So the benefits take the form of more homes for people than will otherwise be built, and they'll be built in locations that have got better accessibility to employment. And then you've got the potential for productivity gains from density, so outweighing those costs there. And then, of course, with more supply of housing and more homes being built, we would expect that would remove some of the upward pressure on prices, and of course more supply, we would expect to see that being a supportive factor in terms of downward pressure on prices over time. And I think also, just in closing, it's important to recognise that if we look ahead, we're not only facing some changes in terms of the development opportunities, the intensification that's going to occur, but we've also got to think about reducing our carbon footprint as a city. Auckland Council does have a climate plan, Te Taru Ki a Tawhiri, which to reach 50% reduction in emissions by 2030, it sort of models the way to get there would be to reduce transport emissions. And so that's got to be much more than just conversions to electric cars, but it involves land use changes, enabling people to forego some of those longer trips if they living at the periphery of the city. And it means enabling people, giving them more choices to get around outside the use of a private car, more choices that suit them. And I think I'll just note, Phil, I know you wanted a bit more out of budget 2022. Looking at it from an Auckland perspective, I guess budgets tend to be written from a national perspective, but there were a couple of things in there that I thought were worth highlighting. So there are significant funds set aside for further planning work for a rapid transit route, CC to N, the city centre to Mangere. That's otherwise known as light rail. So there's funds for further planning work for the next stage of that, and also a feasibility study into the suitability of Manukau Harbour as a location for a future port. So I was just going to add my disclaimer that that's my views and not necessarily those of Auckland Council.
Thank you very much.
And
Thanks
thank you
very
for
much,
listening.
Gary.
You're welcome.
So
I know that was a bit of a probably a bit of a grab bag, Phil. Whizzed through quite a few topics there. So thank you for your patience, and I'm very happy to rewind back to anything that stuck with people.
Can we just go back to the take the slides down? That's good.
Yes, good idea.
And open it up for discussion. Are there other questions, please? Any questions? Clearly, Gary, the budget was about two huge areas of government policy to do with climate change and health reform, and I think they will have an impact on the city clearly, in terms of an obligation to join the party, to play its part in those things. You didn't actually mention health as a feature of a big urban city, but it's probably underwritten in the word COVID.
Yes, well, I am aware that there was that focus on emissions reduction plan and also health sector reform. I guess the way that those were characterised, they do tend to be national policies in scope, so there isn't a lot of specificity in terms of tailoring to Auckland, and I felt like it was perhaps a bit out of my remit to start trying to interpret the government's intentions with respect to those policies in Auckland.
I'm just thinking there may be some value to be had from the fact that we wouldn't have 3 separate health boards around the Auckland city. We'd have one that was able to coordinate health systems and make better use of land use and the distribution of staffing around those hubs of health activity which we have in the city.
Well, I think that's what's one of the arguments, isn't it? Is that with one large organisation, a Health NZ, then you're potentially reducing some of the transaction costs that you see when multiple organisations are trying to negotiate with each other. So some of those transaction costs will be internalised. And so you might, in Auckland, you might see more of a unified city approach. But I think that's one for health planners who are closer to it to comment on than me.
Fair enough. Other questions? Any further questions? I'm interested in your comments, Gary, perhaps on that observation that one of the journalists has been making recently about the number of downtown shops that are not being tenanted, and whether or not there's a rationale for leaving some of the downtown empty.
Well, I think we've started to, I think it's worth noting that we're still in the middle of an Omicron wave. And so we haven't reached a new equilibrium yet in terms of people's choices about where they choose to work. So we've got the flexibility, people choosing to work from home, and then they're weighing up the risk and the inconvenience of having to go into the city. But I would expect over time, some jobs you can work from home because you've already built up your social capital. Mm-hmm. So you need relationships, but that social capital needs to be invested in and maintained. So over time, as you see people perhaps running down their social capital, you see newcomers come into workplaces, you need to keep maintaining those relationships. People can't just rely on distant connections. There's real value, especially for some jobs that are collaborative in nature.
Thanks,
and of course, new people coming into the workforce too.
Okay, I see Bob, Raywin, Morgan. Bob, would you like to go first?
Okay, yeah, I'm just thinking of consequences, and really the consequences of townhouses, multi-level houses, and generally the whole thing that people are selling fairly large sections which had one house and now have multiple houses. So we have multiple level houses with no lift, so that limits who can use them, but also putting as many properties on the land as possible so that there is no parking, which then affects the local community. So there are sort of negative consequences of the way that it's being done. So that the cost cutting, which makes them more affordable, has negative effects.
I think that's a few points that you make, Bob. And when we look at a policy, we have to think about all of the impacts. And so I guess the main thrust of it is to ensure that housing supply can be more responsive to demand, so that people who are perhaps not currently homeowners or insiders, that their demand for a home can be met. And so one way to achieve that is to free up the way we use land, to make it more flexible. And I think what we would expect to see is that where the land is more valuable, that's where development will be more likely to occur. And I think if it's in good locations that's got good access to transport, then perhaps we might see less reliance on private vehicles. But I do think that there would have to be perhaps more oversight from Auckland Transport. We can't just have people who don't have private storage for their vehicles choosing to place those vehicles on public land and clog up streets when that land is actually scarce after all and could be used for other purposes besides just parking.
Raywin.
Oh, kia ora koutou. Thanks, Gary. That was really, really interesting. But I just thinking that to me, it was a presentation for Central Isthmus, the North Shore, and the eastern suburbs. I just felt that a lot of the issues were just removed from what's actually happening in the south and the west, particularly South Auckland. And I mean, I think the big challenge for Auckland is we are so geographically, socioeconomically, and ethnically divided. They all converge together. The North Shore is a different planet from South Auckland. And there are people on the North Shore who have never gone to South Auckland or just associated with gangs, drugs, and poor brown people. And so I guess my thing is about what is Auckland in terms of your role and everything, looking at that. And I mean, I think in the south it's job rich, but the local people don't get the jobs. It's a matter of infrastructure, it's transport, housing. A lot of people in Māngere, Otara, Clendon are aspiring to decent, affordable, healthy rental accommodation, let alone, you know, home ownership. And it just seems to me that, you know, where is the valuable land that, I mean, let's hope what's happening in Glen Innes with Tamaki regeneration, it will actually result in a mixed community, but there is always the risk of sort of gentrification pushing poorer people out to the margin. So yeah, I just really would like your thoughts on that kind of framework and those trends as what's it going to do for our poorer communities. And, you know, that's where the birth rate is. You know, it's brown people in South Auckland who are having the babies, and they are our future. And, you know, they're just not doing well.
Thank you, Raylan, for those comments. And certainly not my intention to gloss over any part of the city or to not recognise it. I think I would really emphasise that I'm taking a longer term view and trying to, I guess, look beyond those that are currently in fortunate positions is really the focus here. So I was really trying to highlight the fact that Auckland's been doing things a certain way, and that might have benefited some people, but there's other people whose voices we don't hear often. And some of those you know, perhaps on the periphery of the city, they're not homeowners, they don't have many choices in terms of how they get around, how they get to work. And so what I'm really trying to highlight here is that by having a more flexible way in which we use our land, then we should see more choices for people about where they locate, and we would see in the future that there'll be more houses built and at a lower price than would otherwise be the case if relative to having a more restrictive supply. And secondly, in terms of transport, I do think that people who live in those outer parts of the city, their experience is a difficult one in terms of they do not have many choices in terms of how they get around. They tend to be very reliant on cars. And so really highlighting the fact that the city could do more with its public transport networks in terms of the number of jobs that are accessible via public transport. And particularly thinking about with I guess the climate challenge, that there are more options for people to get around, not just relying on cars. And so I don't have a broader view in mind, trying to think about voices that we don't hear directly, and trying to think about those who are here today, but also thinking about future generations. And so that's why I was trying to characterise some of those trade-offs with the longer term in focus.
Thank you, Gary. So is that sufficient? Morgan, you've got a question.
Yeah, I guess my question kind of echoes what Bob and Raywin said with the AUP. It's good that it's loosening up restrictions on building, that there's not just a bunch of single unit houses, but how much more, but will there be any form of restrictions about the quality of houses and such, like, so there's like lower income housing and all that, and making sure there's like good access to amenities? Because I work in Mangere Bridge and you just see all these housing going up, but there's like not even a good school near the area, and there's very little houses to support them.
Right, so you're really talking about the quality of housing and what that's going to look like in the future. I mean, I don't have an answer to that now, but I do think a first step is to actually try and take a balanced look at the changes that are being imposed on the city. Some of them the city has chosen to adopt, and some of them are being imposed as a result of the government's intensification enabling policies. But it is very easy to I guess focus on things that we feel uncomfortable about, and I guess you have to ask the question, relative to not taking these steps, what position will we be in a decade from now, or 2 to 3 decades from now, if we have more constricted housing supply and a level of demand that isn't being met, and if we're not able to build more houses in the best locations. So I'm really hopeful that Auckland's on a path to enabling better use of its best located land that's close to jobs, that's close to transport, and enabling more choice for people about where they locate, and not just being pushed to the margins.
Brian, you've got a question.
Thanks, Bill. I was just wondering if you could comment about the tension between, I suppose, population growth and our climate change obligations, and that the climate change obligations aren't per capita, they're a fixed envelope. And I would imagine, I don't know, that most of our overshoot on carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, have come from population growth.
Well, the population growth has been somewhere between 1.5% to 2% per annum. And so if you factor that in between now and 2030, you might think that our population growth would add another, if that's 8 years, then sort of 8 to 12% additional. But the modelling that's been done for Auckland's climate change plan does model 64% reduction in transport emissions being required by 2030 in order to meet that broader target. And so that takes into account projected population growth. So while population growth is a factor, there's a sort of a base level of emissions from current population here. And that's really the driver, that the bulk of the people here and the activities, the emissions have got to come down. So it's not being driven by newcomers.
Thanks.
So, Gary, thank you very much. I just wondered, right back at the beginning, you explained your role within the City Council, and we're very aware that the City Council has its powers and jurisdictions, but then so do the CCOs. And I was wondering if your jurisdiction covered advising the CCOs as well, or does it stay within the council framework?
Oh, well, that's a good question, Phil. Thank you. So do take it as a sort of an Auckland group, Auckland Council family, as you would. So there are people who have similar interests, from an economic perspective at Auckland, Tataki, Auckland Unlimited, and Auckland Transport, and so do have connections with those people, and we freely share information and perspectives. So it's certainly a cross-council group role.
Thank you. And Arthur, this will be the last question. Arthur.
I'd just like to ask, does the super city work for an economist? I'm interested, I've seen suggestions that the optimum civic size of a municipal entity is much lower internationally. I can't remember the figure. It's something like 180,000 people. This is socially and politically, but does it work economically? It has this experiment. I believe we're one of the few places that has such a large entity. Does it work for you, Gary?
Well, really interesting question, Arthur. Thank you. What I would say is that, we're talking about the administrative layer over the city. And so the city itself, it's always been, as Raymond was saying, a large area with disparate regions to it, or disparate parts to it. But collectively, households and businesses form an economy, and that economy runs along regardless of the administrative layers up top. But what we've seen, I guess, with the amalgamation is that perhaps some of the transaction costs with councils having to negotiate with each other and coordinate, perhaps some of the priority setting about where public infrastructure investments should be prioritised, perhaps some of that's been a bit easier to handle, and perhaps speaking to Wellington with one voice has been an advantage in terms of the things that Auckland would like Wellington to do. But on the other side, because economists always want to think not just the benefits but the costs, perhaps it has come at the cost of communities feeling that their decision makers are a step removed, and of course the local boards are an important part of staying connected with those communities. But inevitably there will be transaction costs in terms of inside the council group, disseminating information, disseminating views down and then back up again from local boards. So perhaps there is a bit of a trade-off with perhaps council being larger and not quite as close to its communities, notwithstanding the efforts with local boards, but perhaps the payoff has been an ability to use its scale, share its expertise from its various councils that were merged together, enabled specialisation and enabled prioritisation in terms of infrastructure investment. So I wouldn't say a clear cut one way or the other, but first step to doing a cost benefit analysis is to get a sort of an agreed framework of what the impacts are qualitatively, both the cost and the benefits, and then start to quantify them. So I guess it might depend on where you sit about how you see all of that. But perhaps from an economic perspective, I would venture that Auckland's probably won out overall in terms of its ability to come together with a cohesive unitary plan and a cohesive prioritised set of infrastructure investments. And that's certainly clear from Wellington's perspective, I would assume.
Gary, thank you very much for the time you've taken with us tonight. I appreciate that you haven't been turned into a barbecue in that building, which is with the fire alarm that was going on before. So you've stood the course, and it's been a very interesting session. And I appreciate the amount of work that you put into those slides and the summaries that are provided in the data that was given. From all of us, I'd like to thank you for the contribution you've given. And if you can imagine a clap going through the audience at this point.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for hearing me out. As I say, it's been quite a whistle-stop tour through a number of topics, but as I get deeper into the role, I'm sure I'll be able to dig deeper into some of these, and if there are future opportunities to engage with you, certainly open to it. So thank you all for being very respectful, and it's been nice to connect with you.